and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura, and today I am sharing with you my favorite books that deal with addiction. And I have been planning on doing this video, but I've been saving it for October because October is National Substance Abuse Prevention Month. And if you are familiar with my channel or my podcast, you know that I do try to cover a book versus movie that deals with addiction every so often, because I do think it's really important to bring that addiction awareness and get the conversation going with it. Because so often, whether you're the addict or you have a loved one who struggles with an addiction, our instinct is to just keep it a secret and not talk about it, right? Because we feel embarrassed, we feel shame, we feel guilt, like all these negative emotions that come about. And so we feel like we just can't talk about it and shouldn't talk about it. But that just makes it worse. It's so important to talk about it and bring it out in the open, and just realizing there's more people that struggle with this and that can understand than you might realize. And also, like, I know it's hard to talk about it too, like to your regular family and friends. If they're not in it with you, like you struggle to open up to them about it because you feel like they just won't understand and they'll judge you or something. And so it is so important to seek out those addiction support meetings, AA and Al-Anon being the two I am most familiar with, because there, the people in those meetings know exactly what it feels like to be in your shoes, and you can share. I mean, especially if you have a sponsor, one-on-one is where you can really go in depth. But even in a meeting, you can share these things that other people might not understand. But the people in that meeting, they'll get it and they won't judge you because they have been in your shoes before. And there's just such a strength that comes from that. Not only just getting it out, but getting it out with people who know what you're going through. So if you struggle with alcoholism, definitely check out your local AA meetings. And if you have a loved one who struggles with alcoholism, definitely check out an Al-Anon meeting, because those will make such a big difference in your life. And also, there's like a misconception, I feel like sometimes, where people think Al-Anon is a place where you go to just complain about the alcoholic. But Al-Anon actually isn't about the alcoholic or the addict. Al-Anon is about you and about like learning that you don't need to fix everybody's problems and you don't need to take on their burdens, and lovingly detaching and letting them do their thing and allowing yourself to continue living your life regardless of what's happening with them, right? Which can be really hard to do when it's someone you love, whether it's, you know, a parent, a sibling, a partner, whatever it is, a close friend. I mean, when you're early to Al-Anon, you can use it as a place to vent, but ultimately it is about fixing yourself and finding your own inner healing, even if the addict keeps drinking and keeps using. But anyway, also I am wearing my sweatshirt for the Overlook Hotel, and you might think I'm just wearing it because I'm a Stephen King fan or because it's October, which both of those are true, but I'm also wearing it because Stephen King himself is a recovered alcoholic and drug addict, and addiction shows up a lot in his books. And I have one book I'll be sharing today with it, which has so many AA stuff all throughout the book. And so I love that he brings awareness to the addiction by writing about it in his fictional stories, and yet you can tell it's so personal to him, even though it's in a fictional book. So yeah, two of his books will be talked about at the end of this video. I'm going to begin with my nonfiction memoirs, and then at the end I have 3 fiction books I want to talk about. But the first one I'll talk about is The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. Jeanette was raised by, sorry, the terrible glare. I'm just going to have an image put up. So Jeanette was raised by a dad who was an alcoholic and a mom she called herself an excitement addict. And so the mom, even though the dad, she could have left him and provided a better life for her kids because the dad wasn't getting better, she chose to stay with him because she liked the excitement and she liked the drama. Even though she was like stone cold sober, she had her own issues. It also talks about how her mom was like a sugar addict, and so she had her own things she went to. But as far as substances go, she never drank, but she loved the drama that came from being with a man who drank. And so I love this. I mean, obviously it's from Jeanette's perspective, but it does shine a great light on just the relationships when one person is sober and the other is drinking, because there's a part where the dad does get sober, but then when he reconnects with the wife, he starts drinking again because she wasn't in a healthy spot and she wasn't ready to live a sober life with her husband. And so it's just the importance of both people getting help, right? Which Al-Anon and AA, right? Both people need to be going to those meetings. Both people need to be getting therapy because if you're with someone who struggles with addiction, especially in a marriage sense, I think too, if you're choosing it, right? If you choose to marry someone who's struggling with addiction, and if you're just addicted to that life, that drama, you need to get help. And if the other person is going to get sober, right? And so I think, oftentimes we focus on the addict, but their loved ones need to be getting help too. Like, I want to say especially the spouses, but I feel like everybody related or connected to the addict, if they're trying to fix the addict, right? Or if they're addicted to the drama that comes from knowing an addict, then you need to get help and figure out why it is you want that drama in your life. Also, people who know an addict will sometimes like have martyr syndrome, right? Where they are just like, look at how I'm suffering and look what you're doing to me and I do everything for you and whatever. Like, they love being the martyr and they love being the victim. So again, so important for both sides to get help. So Jeanette Walls covers that in her book with her parents, but obviously it's about her childhood and what it was like for her to have a dad who struggled with alcohol. But yeah, this was a fantastic book. It's pretty short. I would highly recommend it. I actually really liked the movie too. It has gotten some negative reviews, but I enjoyed it. And next up is one that is one of my personal favorites, and that is Another Night in Suck City by Nick Flynn. This one I love because Nick Flynn is just such a beautiful and poetic and eloquent writer. Like, Jeanette Walls is a good writer too, but she's more like, his prose are just very beautiful. And like I said, he is a poet. He has books of poems. And so I do love reading books that are written by poets because they just have such a beautiful way of writing. And there are passages in here where he describes his emotions, which, by the way, so Nick Flynn, his dad left him at a young age, but he would like get letters from him. And then in adulthood, he reconnects with his dad, and his dad is an alcoholic. So he deals with the relationship with having a father who is an alcoholic, but also he himself later struggles with addiction, and he shares his recovery. But yeah, there were passages in here like talking about what it was like to have this complex relationship with someone who's an addict, and he just words it so well. And it's also just a really interesting story too, because, by the way, his dad was homeless, which actually Jeanette Walls, her parents become homeless, and how in both cases, like, the parents were like choosing to be homeless. And so it just brings up topics of the homeless and the different things that cause someone to be homeless. But anyway, he also struggles with his mom because she ends up committing suicide. So dealing with that as well in this book. So he has a lot going on in this book, but it is so well written. It is a fantastic story. And like I said, it is probably one of my personal favorites because, I love reading books about addiction because it's bringing awareness, but I also, it feels good to feel seen, right? And to know, again, similar to these support groups, knowing that other people are going through these struggles too, and just being able to relate, even though his situation, was different on many levels, there's things I could still relate to. And yeah, I just loved it so much. The movie stars Robert De Niro and Paul Dano and is very good, but as always, the book is better. Not as always, but most of the time. And then I also wanted to give a shout out to his sequel of sorts, which is the reenactments. He wrote the reenactments when his first book was being made into a movie. So in the reenactments, he talks about what it was like to have his life be turned into a movie, but he also talks about, because the movie came out like 10 years later. So over the course of 10 years, obviously his relationship with his dad has changed in various ways. His father is getting older, things are changing. And so it was really interesting to see what his relationship with his father was like 10 years later. And he also talks about, his continual struggle with just his relationship with his mom and the fact that she committed suicide and just that emptiness from her not being around and all of that. So like I said, he deals with some heavy topics, but he does it in just such a beautiful way, in such a poignant way. And I absolutely love his writing, and I would highly recommend both of these. Next up, we have The Tender Bar by J.R. Moringer. This one is different because both of, the three previous books, they're not like depressing books, but they are more serious. Whereas like the first half, maybe more than the first half of The Tender Bar, this is about a boy father left him when he was young. And so he spends a lot of time in this bar that his uncle works at. And so he's basically raised around all these alcoholics, right? Because his uncle, who is a bartender, the bar owner, and all the regulars in the bar, they're always drinking. As he gets older, he himself becomes an alcoholic as well. But in the first half, he shares a lot of stories, looking back fondly on these crazy antics they got into when they were drinking, both when he was a kid and they were drinking, and then as he was an adult and he was drinking and the crazy antics he got into, which I get it's unrealistic for someone who is sober. If they look back on their drinking days and was I never had any fun times, it's just unrealistic. Of course there's fun stories. Of course there's crazy things that they want to talk about because it was fun. That's what got them hooked on drinking in the first place a lot of the time. And so I realize it's unrealistic to expect him to not have these funny stories he wants to share. But there were some of them where I was just man, this isn't funny. These were just a bunch of drunks being stupid and irresponsible, especially if it involves drunk driving. I don't care what the crazy story is. If they're drunk driving, like, that's just, I mean, clearly they're not thinking straight because they're drunk, but like when you're driving drunk, like that is just so irresponsible. So yeah, I don't know. I have mixed feelings in that sense, but he does do a great job though. Near the end of the book, he starts seeing the reality of alcoholism and what it is doing to these men, and these men he's known his whole life, and seeing this mean side to them that the alcoholism brings out. And one guy, like, his life is ruined due to alcohol. And then he himself gets sober because he realizes that he himself has an issue with alcohol and is depending on it, and it's not helping him have a better life. And so he does get sober in the end, and he talks about his sobriety. But yeah, so, you know, it does change near the end of the book, but for a lot of the book, especially in the first half, it's him sharing these funny stories about drinking. And yeah, so I had mixed feelings about that. But he also talks about his relationship with his mom, and I really love that part, and just the bond they had, how he spent his whole life looking for a father figure when, like, everything he needed to know about, like, how to be a man, like, his mom was right there being a great example, because to be a good man, you just be a good person, and his mom was a good person. But anyway, so overall, I do really like this book. I would recommend it. The movie I liked it well enough, but I liked the book better. But next up is Beautiful Boy by David Sheff. And David Sheff, his son is the one who struggles with meth. And so David Sheff writes about his experience as being the father of a drug addict. And his son has his own book called Tweak. I have not read that one, but I know the movie Beautiful Boy is a combination of both memoirs. I have not read Tweak, but I have read Beautiful Boy, and I did really like it. I also love the movie. I would highly recommend it. And yeah, I love Beautiful Boy because, again, it is written from the perspective of a loved one, of an addict, and the struggle that he had. And this is a bit different because it's his son, but I still found it really interesting and really touching and really sad. And the struggle he goes through too, because when your child becomes an addict, you know, he reflects on, like, what did I do wrong? Like, how did this happen? You know, I thought we raised him so well, right? And so just those conflicting emotions, which I can't relate to. I don't have kids, but yeah, so that would be really hard. But obviously, you know, that's the other thing that Al-Anon teaches you, is to not blame yourself, right? They are their own person. They made their own decisions. Even if it's your child and you raised them, they still are their own person making their own decisions, right? So you can't take responsibility for them, at least not entirely, especially once they're an adult. But anyway, so yeah, I've read this book. I've seen the movie. I keep meaning to do a book first movie. I need to reread it though before I do, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But he does talk about going to Al-Anon meetings, which I really loved. And this is one where he does talk about, like, again, it's through him seeing his son as his son struggles to get sober, because early on in the book, the son is going to rehab trying to get sober, but he keeps relapsing. And so we do see that struggle here in this book. And sadly, even after, you know, he wrote Beautiful Boy and his son wrote Tweak, even after that, the son still relapsed again at some point later on. And so there's a part in the book where a rehab person tells him, like, relapse is part of recovery. And the dad is like, what? Like, no, he's supposed to get sober and stay sober. But that's not how it happens. You know, 9 times out of 10, it takes a bit of time. They get sometimes sober and then drink and get some time. And so you just need to have a lot of patience. But anyway, so this is a good one that I would recommend. And that's it for my nonfiction. To move on to fiction, this is one I don't actually physically own, but Leaving Las Vegas by John O'Brien. I read this last year, and this is like the heaviest book out of all of these. Like, you know, like I said, The Tender Bar has more of a lighthearted feel, whereas the other books are definitely more serious. But Leaving Las Vegas is like serious and heavy and depressing. And I'll just say right now, it does not have a happy ending. So this is not a feel-good story. But John O'Brien himself struggled with alcoholism. And then he wrote this book, which is fiction, but has a lot of his personal experiences within it. So semi-autobiographical. And also he himself ended up committing suicide sometime later, which is just really sad because he relapsed again and was drinking. And so yeah, this is a heavy one, like I said. And honestly, like, I can't speak for someone who struggles. Like, I had someone message me and they said that they struggled with addiction and they read this book and it really helped them. But as someone who has a loved one with an addiction, if your loved one is still in their addiction, I would not recommend reading this book because it is way too depressing. And when someone is in their addiction, you need to hold on to whatever hope you can, right? And not read a depressing book about things not going well. Anyway, this book is about a man who, his addiction has basically ruined his life. He's divorced. He was fired from his job, and now he has decided that he's just going to drink himself to death, basically. And there are so many things within this story where you can tell it's clearly written by someone who struggles this, because he shares such specific stories that only an alcoholic would know, or someone who's super close to an alcoholic. And so, it's definitely realistic, and it definitely, puts you in the shoes of the addict and what they're going through and how they feel. But yeah, and in this, he falls in love with a woman who is a prostitute, so you have that going on too. So a lot of things about this book make it one that I wouldn't just recommend it to anybody because it is heavy in a lot of various ways. But then, like I said, I do know that it has helped some people, and maybe if you're struggling with alcohol yourself, reading about how bad it can get, I guess could wake you up a bit and realize you need to stop so that you don't get to that point. So maybe it's inspirational in some sense. I'm including it on this list because it is a great book about alcoholism when it's at its worst and when the person just really is not going to stop and they just want to die, essentially. So not a feel-good story. But yeah, anyway, if you've read it, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And same goes for all of these books. And if you have books you have read about addiction that you really loved, comment down below and let me know. And next up is one of my just all-time favorite books, and that is Misery by Stephen King, which you might think, why is Misery on this list? It's about a guy who is kidnapped, a writer who is kidnapped by his #1 fan and is held hostage. But did you know that Annie Wilkes, the #1 fan, is symbolic for addiction? So Stephen King wrote this book as he himself was getting sober, and he has said, he didn't say it at the time this was released because he said he just wasn't ready to be open about it, and he also wanted people to appreciate the story for what it is on the surface. But years later, he confirmed that it is about addiction, and Annie Wilkes represents addiction and how it holds you hostage, and it hobbles you, and it cripples you, and it humiliates you, and it makes you feel less than human. And yet at the same time, it's your #1 fan, and it can help you feel better in some ways. And the struggle of letting go of the addiction, the same way Paul struggles to escape Annie. And there's times where he is actively trying to escape, but he's not able to. And then there's other times where he just accepts that he is being held hostage and he tries to make the best of it. The same way an addict will kind of be like, you know what? Trying to stop is too hard. I'm just going to accept this and make the most of it, right? And oh man, like when you read this book on just a surface level, it's still a great like horror novel, a thriller, whatever. But when you read it knowing that Annie represents addiction, like it is just incredible. And it, like I've read it twice and both times it made me cry. It is just so powerful and so many passages in here that are just so strong and so poignant and so beautiful and so heartbreaking, and it can fit for, obviously describes what it's like when you're the addict, but there's some things that can fit to describe a person who knows someone who struggles with addiction, because addiction is like a family disease. And even if other family members are sober, they're still like sick with that illness of addiction, and they struggle with like the obsession. And like I said, keeping it a secret and neglecting yourself and just the way it can harm you indirectly, but also directly. But anyway, so yeah, this one, fantastic. Like this, again, like knowing Stephen King, this is like a horror novel and there are some scenes that are a bit violent. So if you're squeamish about that, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're okay with that, definitely read this and keep in mind that Annie represents addiction and the story within the story, because we get snippets from the book he is writing, and that also is very symbolic. And I have a video talking about the symbolism of the story within the story if you want to hear me talk about that. And last but not least is a book that Stephen King wrote in 2013. So not one of his later books because it was 10 years ago now, but that is Dr. Sleep. And this is, sorry about the glare again, I'm just going to put an image up, but this is about Danny from The Shining, the child from The Shining. And this is about him as an adult, and he himself struggles with alcoholism just like his dad had. And so I love this because it talks about how he was raised by an alcoholic, and so he was like, wow, like I am never drinking, I'm never going to become that way. And yet he does. I mean, he doesn't become entirely like his dad, but he does become an alcoholic, right? And so often that happens in real life where people will be raised by an alcoholic and think like, wow, I'm never going to do that. And then they do. And so, that genetic, but also, the cycle of addiction that happens when you're raised with someone with an addiction. But this one too just has so much Alcoholics Anonymous stuff all throughout. And I love it because it's not a spoiler because it happens fairly early on where Danny, he does become sober, and he becomes sober through AA. It shows AA and support groups like that in such a positive light and how important they are and what strength they bring and the sense of community you get. And again, having a place where you can share all of these things that you just want to keep secret, but at the same time you want to get it out, and you can share it there and not worry about judgment because it's that safe space where people know what it's like to be in your shoes, and you can share these things and get it off your chest. And yeah, and I love that Danny gets sober where it's Jack in The Shining. Obviously, spoiler alert for The Shining, he doesn't, he dies. And so I just love seeing Danny where even though he has that same struggle as his dad and he does have that same family illness, Anonymous, but he is able to finally break the cycle, and he is able to do what his dad had not been able to do, and he's able to get sober and to live a better, healthier life. And yeah, it's such a great story. Again, it is Stephen King, so it is a horror novel, and so if it's not like especially scary, but it's still, it's still in the horror genre, so it isn't one I would widely recommend unless you're okay with horror novels. But yeah, I do love the positive way it shows Alcoholics Anonymous. And I also love that it's showing, because The Shining, we have Jack, who is an alcoholic, and the book definitely humanizes him and shows that internal battle, which I guess I could say The Shining is like an honorable mention because that is definitely about alcoholism. But again, it's like not a happy story. So, because Jack does not succeed. And so it kind of makes alcoholics seem like they're someone who is scary and who can't change potentially. There are some hopeful moments in The Shining. But anyway, I love that Dr. Sleep shows someone who struggles with alcoholism and yet they're able to get sober and turn their life around and become a better person. And it's such a great positive representation of a sober alcoholic and of support groups. Anyway, I feel like I kind of rambled at times in this video, but those are the books that I like that are about addiction, that I love, that I would highly recommend. If you are struggling with addiction, or if you know someone who is currently struggling with addiction, which going into the holidays, the winter time, the holidays, that can be a tough time for people who are trying to be sober. But if you are currently struggling in one way or another, like there is hope to hold on to, and it might feel so scary, but it doesn't have to be. And you can reach out to help, search, your local support group meetings. And seriously, they make such a big difference. It took me so long to go to one, but when I finally did, it made such a difference. And also reading books like this too, like I said, it helps you feel seen. It helps you know that you're not the only one dealing with this. And it helps most of these stories, like I said, Leaving Las Vegas is not an uplifting story, but the other books they provide some hope and show that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that not all addicts have, this sad ending, right? There are the success stories. So comment down below your favorite books that deal with addiction. And I could make a whole nother video about this for movies too, because there's movies I love that aren't based on books, which I'll just say right now, Flight with Denzel Washington, incredible movie. Love it so much. And it's about a pilot who struggles with alcoholism. But anyway, thank you for watching my video. Like and subscribe, comment down below your thoughts. And yeah, I will see you next time. Bye.